Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Enriching Security Visibility with a Scientific Approach to Cyber Risks, sponsored by CYE. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Matt Bromiley, SANS Certified Instructor, and Reuven Aronashvili, CYE Founder and CEO. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carol. And hey, everyone, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. We're excited to have everyone here with us today. I'm joined by Reuven. Reuven, you there?
Yes, hi, how are you, Matt?
Awesome, I'm doing very good, thanks. Everyone, you might hear my keyboard in the background because I'm actually going to ask that we send out a link to the report that this webcast was kind of started by. So let me first start there. So I'm going to go back and say, first off, thank you for joining us. I'm glad, Reuven, thank you for being here with me as well. I'm aware we're in very different time zones, sir. So we are sharing either side of the sun right now. But this webcast, everyone, is actually a follow-up to the SANS 2021 report that came out in June this year that talks about making visibility definable and measurable. And the associated link, or I should say the link for the associated paper, just got issued out to the chat. So everyone can click on that to get to a copy of that report as well. And Reuven and the folks over at CYE helped sponsor that report and bring that together. So Reuven, we're forever thankful for that. Thank you very much. But I am glad to be with you here today because I want to talk a little bit further about the idea of visibility and why visibility is necessary to an organization. And in fact, that brings us to the title of today's webcast, Enriching Security Visibility with and here's the kicker, a scientific approach to cyber risks. Reuven, this is where you guys come in, and over at CYE, you do some really, really cool tech, and we're going to talk about it today in this webcast. But do you want to give everyone a really quick synopsis of who CYE is?
Of course. So hi, everyone. I'm Reuven Aronashvili. I've started CYE in 2012 when we started to work with different organizations worldwide to really take their cybersecurity maturity level from a given situation to the needed situation, which is also a good question. What is the needed situation? For that, we've developed a capability that allows full traceability and visibility into the process of cybersecurity improvement. So we start practically with the visibility exercise in which we start with asset discovery, then red teaming or penetration testing to identify the organizational vulnerabilities, then we quantify the risk, and in the end, optimize the mitigation planning based on an approach that we'll demonstrate today, and I think will be highly relevant for most attendees in this specific
Excellent.
event.
Reuven, I love that whole breakdown and the way you brought that out for us. So everything that Reuven just went through, folks, is something that we need to make sure we're including and considering as part of our approach to enterprise information security, in my opinion. Now, those of you that may have seen me on a webcast before, you know I preach and preach and preach about visibility into an organization, into your assets, into what you have. And in fact, I end up talking with a lot of organizations, and Reuven, you can nod your head along if you hear this happen too. But I talk with a lot of organizations who ask me about all of these advanced threats out there and things that they hear about. The attackers are doing this, they're now doing that, APT this, nation state that. It's all these different variables that keep them up at night. And then I ask a really simple question and I say, you know what, let's start easy. How many Windows systems do you have in your environment? And they're completely perplexed. That's the one that stumps them. So on a very basic level for me, not knowing how much you have of something inside of your environment, to me, I think makes it really hard to secure, really hard to effectively secure. And that's what we're gonna really zoom in on today. And a lot of the key points we're gonna hit on today are, first off, that concept of visibility, why that's important, but then also, and I'm excited because CYE's got some really cool walkthroughs of how understanding the attack path and understanding how attackers do what they do, how we can insert certain defender advantages by analyzing the environment into those points and stopping things there. And I'm gonna quickly lead into kind of our first discussion or our first example. But one thing that I've had constant discussions with organizations about is let's take the hot topic of, I'm gonna call it maybe the year this day. Reuven, if there's one attack or one piece of malware everyone's scared about these days, what is it?
Oh, everyone is talking about ransomware, of course.
Everyone.
Yeah, it's the number one issue. However, ransomware is a very, let's say, complex process to get to the endpoint. But I guess you're going to show us how to get there.
We're going to walk through that, but Reuven set me up for the perfect stage right there, which is, yes, ransomware is that big hot topic of the day today, but he's 100% right. Ransomware is not a single system, and we're going to walk through an example of this in just a moment, but it is not a single system attack or a single system thing, unless you have an environment of one system, in which case then it could be. But for all intents and purposes, ransomware is an attack that requires visibility. And in our opinion, defense of it requires visibility and understanding of your environment as well. So lots of really good points tying together here. But let's go ahead and jump into kind of one of our first discussions. And I've got something which is fresh and hot off the presses for everybody. I went and, well, I shouldn't say I went. I woke up this morning, started going through the what's going on in the industry news, as I always do, and I came across an article, or really a blog post, but also kind of a report at the same time, published this morning by our friends over at the deferreport.com. Quick sidebar. If you have not familiar with this blog post, but you are a defender, you really need to get familiar really quick, because it's going to be very crucial to the types of discussions we're going to have today. But they published something this morning that we went and captured, and I grabbed some of like the really important points, I think, for our webcast this morning or this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are. But the title of it is Iced ID to, I'm going to call it Zing Locker in 24 hours. So of course, we're going to center around ransomware right now, just because it is a fresh article, and there's a lot of really good points in here I want everyone to kind of understand. And Reuven, I'm going to ask you to join me in the discussion and the analysis of this too, and feel free to tell me, where we need to make sure defenders understand what's happening. But my first kind of point for everyone to understand and to be aware of here is that attacks like this, they take process, they take time, and I granted 24 hours is not a lot of time, but attackers need to have a few things in order to make these types of attacks successful. And we're going to kind of look at what some of those are. So the first kind of key piece of the timeline that I wanted to grab and throw in here, of course, they're using Cobalt Strike. I have to say, of course, because I feel like everyone these days is using Cobalt Strike. Reuven, you talked earlier about red teams and pen tests and how you guys use some of that data. It's a tool that we see all over the place. But here's what I like about that. Go ahead.
Keep in mind that this is a legitimate tool. I mean, the fact that bad people are using it, that's a different story. But it's a very powerful tool, very nice tool for red team. We have it as well. We have also an alternative that we've developed for under the radar kind of attacks, but that's a legitimate tool, and identification of this tool becomes harder and harder because different, let's say, phenomena and configurations that we see there, but we can talk about it.
Yeah, for sure. So Reuven brings up a great point, everyone, which is, some of these attacks, they're not being conducted with like a proprietary one-time use or single instantiated tool, if you will. It is a toolkit or an exploit kit that is known and is used by the good guys and the bad guys. And the thing I like about that is if the good guys are using the same thing, then I can study that behavior and see how I can bring that back to the same analysis that Reuven and his team are doing to help identify this critical attack path. And then again, cut that off a little bit earlier. So that's the first thing for everyone to note. I'm not gonna, those of you that may follow this, I'm not gonna get into the whole offensive security debate. I'm gonna get into, if an attacker comes at me with a tool that that someone like Reuven can bring to the table, or Reuven studies and analyzes and uses that to build his security out of, then guess what? I like that merge happening, because then I know that what he's looking at is what the attackers are doing, and I'm a big fan of that one there. But I want to pick up on perhaps maybe the most important step here inside of the little screenshot that I dropped in, which is within a matter of 10 minutes, we went from that initial Cobalt Strike beacon to that lateral movement to the domain controller. And that, of course, is perhaps, I would say, the most necessary and critical step of this attack path, is being able to move from this, from that first compromised system over to the domain controller, because once they're on that domain controller, that's their credentials. That's really to get the credentials to launch against the rest of the environment. And let me just pause there. If I can't get credentials to move to the rest of the environment, folks, that's a very limited in scope ransomware attack at all. I need to have those to be able to move around through the environment, to deploy and distribute my ransomware around, to lock up those systems of value. So it should be. But what we're running into, and Reuven, you tell me if you've seen this too, what we're running into, we see far too many accounts with far too many privileges being deployed out there. So while the movement to the domain controller feels appropriate and feels necessary, sometimes adversaries run into the credentials that they need right on the first system, because there's just too many credentials, too much privilege, or someone's doing something with an account that they shouldn't be doing. And it makes this attack path a little bit shorter, because the domain controller is a nice stop, but it's almost then becomes a leisurely stop, not a necessary stop, if you will. And I think that is perhaps maybe my first takeaway from this report when it comes to why visibility is key, and how knowing how someone can move through your environment is key. Because if I need to get to the domain controller, great. There's a forced stop in the process. Reuven, we can do all kinds of stuff if the domain controller is required, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Once you know that it's in the critical path, right, you can, in a way, anticipate that, then you can react accordingly. But keep in mind that, getting to the domain controller is also a process of, for example, reusing credentials, right? That's something that we see so often, right? And it's, in a way, still surprised me every time, that you see, for example, just last week, we've analyzed an organization that is using a specific product for backup, right? And the local admin is shared among those backup agents, including the domain controller, in which, local admin on a domain controller is practically a domain admin. And using this by just, utilizing the same user, same password from the first compromised machine, you're able to immediately compromise the domain controller. That's too easy, right? But still, the fact that you know that someone is going to go through this path will definitely be handy when we'll talk about how we map and analyze those attack routes in a second.
Exactly. So there we go. So that's like the important takeaway, is that this had to occur. And then it is, and watch the time frame here, right? We get 7:28, whatever the local, I'm hoping UTC, but 19:28 UTC, lateral movement to the domain controller. 9 minutes later is when the lateral movement moved to the other servers. So watch that. Within 10 minutes, I'm going back and forth in my screenshots here. Within 10 minutes, we get from first system to domain controller. Within 9 minutes, we go from domain controller to other servers inside of the environment. So we go from one to many in a matter of 19 minutes, let's say. Now, the article does go and talk about some of the tools that are used and things like that. This may have required a little more manual invention, because I'll tell you, there are some scripts out there that can do all of this in a matter of seconds. But again, I want us to focus on understanding that critical attack path of compromised system to domain controller, and then down to the rest of the environment, or down to the applicable servers as need be. Reuven just talked about the backup servers, which is another huge target as well for ransomware actors that are out there. But I want you to start thinking about, if I am an adversary inside of this environment, I don't walk in knowing what all of the various assets are, where they're located, how to get to them easiest, what is the right account, and things like that. I don't walk in knowing that information at all. Instead, adversary lands in an environment, they've got to build out their own form of visibility. And the critical attack path then becomes fairly dynamic for them, meaning it may not be the same company to company, target to target, victim to victim. Overall, the process is the same. Credentials, lateral movement, ransomware, lockup, hopefully we get paid, and we're on our way. but the intricacies of all that are unique to every environment that you're in. And I know Reuven's going to spend some time talking about this because that uniqueness is actually your strength as a defender. The unique parts about your environment, how many folks have hooks into your environment, how many accounts, how many assets, all of these things are very critical to identifying the unique critical paths inside of your environment, number one, and then what an adversary would need to do to get through those. But all of this that I'm saying, and hopefully this digression is making sense, because I'll summarize it with this is all from the viewpoint of the adversary. The adversary gets a foothold via some piece of malware. They've then got to explore, reconnaissance, find, and then execute their attack as appropriate and things like that. They're in the environment for, in this case, 24 hours, very short period of time. Defenders, this is your home. This is the environment that you protect. You've got to know this environment better than the adversaries do. Someone who's in your environment for 24 hours should not be able to gain a visibility advantage, and I'm tying it back to our subject here, should not be able to gain a visibility advantage just because they take the effort to perform the scans, perform the reconnaissance, and understand that attack path. And maybe the final screenshot that I'll drop in here, which I grabbed from the report, is actually some of the initial discovery commands that are done by the iced ID malware when it gets into the environment. Now, this is really basic reconnaissance, pulling an IP address, enumerating groups, enumerating the domain information, who are the members of the domain admins, so on and so forth. This is basic reconnaissance, but I think that there is a really interesting link between what the adversary needs and what the defender needs in this screenshot alone. Adversaries get in the environment, they're in the dark, they don't know where they need to go or what the next turn is. Defenders, you have all the lights turned on, but you may not know which adversary tactic to look for necessarily. That does not mean the adversary has an advantage. I would rather be in the light trying to find someone doing something malicious than I would be in the dark trying to discover things all over again. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today from your defense advantage perspective. You've got all the lights turned on. Let's make sure we're seeing everything with the lights turned on. Let's make sure we're seeing all of the critical attack paths in our environment. Let's make sure we're evaluating, and Reuven's I'm setting Reuven up, he's gonna talk through all this. Let's make sure we're seeing the different entry vectors, the different ways to move throughout my environment, the different ways to exploit the environment, so on and so forth. And that's really what we're gonna focus on today. So Reuven, thanks for letting me take this ransomware discussion and really kind of hammer home that they're in the dark, you're in the light point. Let's go ahead, Reuven, I'm gonna hand it over to you now. And I'm probably going to keep interrupting you as you're talking because we had a really good conversation about this before we came on the air right now. But I want to hand it over to you to start talking to us about how CYE does what they do, some of the amazing technology you guys do, how you bring that in. Take it away, sir. And like I said, I'll be interrupting you as time goes on because there's a lot of great points I want to make sure we drive home. But Reuven, take it away.
So thank you very much, Matt. And I think that, you know, the thing that you mentioned about visibility, I really think that that's key. I mean, really key for everything that we do. You cannot protect your organization without knowing what you have. That's sound maybe very basic. However, in most organizations that we are working with, right, visibility is not a solved problem, right? That's something that still needs work in order to, to be able to identify and to defend against those specific attacks and those specific assets. So specifically in our organization, we took the concept of let's say the offensive concept in mind while we come and bring the defensive perspective into play. So if you think about it, we attack it from the offensive side and protect it from the defensive side while we have the offensive side in mind. And that's, from our point of view, the way to really try and predict or anticipate the next steps coming from those specific attackers. So just to maybe explain that for a second. Today we see multiple tools and capabilities running in the organization. And in a way, the main focus is really to try and identify more and more vulnerabilities in the organization, you know, assign some kind of scoring to those specific vulnerabilities, and in the end, work with a very pragmatic approach of let's fix the critical first, then the high levels, then medium level, and so on and so forth. The problem is that this kind of disconnected, out of context evaluation brings you to the same spot over and over again, in which you are dealing with several things that might be critical to, let's say, some kind of analysis that is not really or not necessarily let's say, aligned with your business needs and with your internal processes and so on and so forth. However, that's still the leading, let's say, approach that we see in a lot of organizations. So if you think about now the situation that asset inventory or visibility is limited, vulnerability scanning capabilities are also limited or not perfect, then you get by definition a situation that is lacking. And more than that, the way that you prioritize, it's really based on what a specific scoring system was generating for you based on a vulnerability to vulnerability concept rather than full attack routes that really explain the process, as you mentioned before. As you know, a single attack is not really a single vulnerability. Those are multiple vulnerabilities connected together into a chain of events that provides you as a defender the opportunity to first identify the situation and prevent the situation, or at least respond to the situation in a timely manner before it becomes critical. And those are the topics that we want to emphasize today. So we take the traditional approach and we are going to change state of mind on how really we are going to add context into the visibility parameter, and more than that, how do we measure this specific visibility and quantify the risk specifically on those specific attack routes.
Reuven, before you move on, I've got a quick story to add on here for some folks who want to see this in kind of like a historical context. Do you remember when NotPetya came out, and it was that whole big issue, and that took the world by storm? Companies around the globe, I think there's companies still dealing from that attack. But the reason I mentioned NotPetya is because it brings me back to when the Eternal Blue, those different vulnerabilities came out. And I remember two types of phone calls I made to clients I was working with at that time. Some clients called me because I was on the phone with others. They were like, I just heard about this thing. I don't know what it is. How does it work? Should we be worried? What should we do? Do we need to buy a thing? Do we need to implement this? Do I need to hire people? They were just freaking out about what to do. There was other people, other C-suite members I'd call up and I'd say, hey, I just want to let you know about this thing in case you need to spin up any operations. And they just asked me, what is it and what does it do? And I gave a really brief protocol overview. And they said, yeah, we're fine. And they hung up, went back to bed, and they were done. And I think for anyone who's wondering, what does context mean to me? For me, that story will always be the best example of context, because someone was able to look a massive vulnerability like that. Anyone you go to and you say, do you need to be concerned about this? The answer should always be yes. But someone knew his attack surface so well, and he knew the context of his environment so well that I could come at him with a CVSS score of 10 and he'd be like, yeah, no, I think we're fine. And then just move right on. And I'll bring it to the real world, and I'll say, you know, for everyone who's probably spent the better part of this year fighting, I don't know, Reuven, how much have you had to fight with Exchange servers over the past 6 to 8 months or so? For anyone who's fighting the Exchange server issue,
too many times.
Far too many, right? And I'm not slamming on Exchange. I want to slam more on the, you know, if anyone wants to think about what Reuven's saying in context of this past year, how much time have you spent chasing Exchange and chasing Exchange issues? And I think the context that Reuven's going to talk about next is going to maybe not, you know, it's not going to remove the vulnerabilities, but it might change the way we go about chasing vulnerabilities. And that's really what I'm excited to make sure we talk about. So I just want to interject that story because context is so key. You need to know your environment, and that is part of the visibility side of things. So I'm sorry, Reuven, keep going, but I wanted to insert my little example there.
Oh, thank you very much for that. So really to continue this specific story, right? And when you talk about how to understand the context, or you manage attack surface, or you know, this kind of question, how do I get even to a situation that I understand that? We have 3 steps of, you know, changing a little bit the way that you think about the problem in order to be able to achieve first the visibility that you're looking for, and second, to add all the relevant context to this visibility. So these 1 to 3 items that we are going to present are key in our analysis, and we'll show you in a second also how those are connected to a full process that we've developed here, but that's something that can be utilized by every organization. First item that I think that is really one of the most important items is really stop thinking about vulnerabilities and start thinking in terms of attack routes or complete attacks against organizations. Like, that's a great example that you've mentioned at the beginning, Matt. You discussed a specific situation of ransomware in a specific organization, and that's something that started at some point, and we've seen how that actually moved along and laterally in the organization in multiple opportunities, let's say, for the defender to first identify and prevent those specific items. But when you think about the full process, right, and not only the vulnerability at the beginning, like you just mentioned, internal blue. Yeah, so internal blue, that's great, but that's just the first step, right? What next? And if you think about the attack route completely, then you first start to capture a specific, let's say, at least mental image, when I think really that we need to do that more than a mental image, but you start to understand the attack surface of your organization in a very specific graph. Then you understand which vulnerability is connected to which vulnerability and how those together can influence the organization. Which brings me to the second point, what influence the organization means, right? So, as technical people, either red teamers, blue teamers, or IT departments or security departments, usually think in terms of technical risk. As you mentioned, CVSS 10, eternal blue, right? That's a very critical item. Technically, yes. But to the business, is it a technical risk or a critical risk to the business? Maybe yes and maybe no. That depends really on the business context. And from my point of view, that's a very important point, right? When you look at the attack route, you see at the end of the attack route, you need to get some kind of gain as an attacker. Running an offensive, let's say, organization, that's a business. You need to gain something in the end. And if you understand what is the objective of the attacker, and more than that, what are your objectives as business to protect, then you are able to set the context and the priorities to the specific attack routes that we mentioned before. And last but not least, the item that I think that is highly important is stop thinking about your organization as a siloed organization. The organization is part of an ecosystem. Ecosystem includes basic things like all the software that you're using from, you mentioned Exchange, right? So from Microsoft, Apple, or whatever kind of environment that you're running in your organization, through your supply chain, service providers, everyone that is sitting around your organization, your cloud environment that is also part of the ecosystem. So think about the potential catastrophe that you have in case of a major breach in one of the big cloud providers. And when you understand that, that's part of your risk, then we always say there is always a zero-day vulnerability, but not a zero-day attack scenario. Because attack scenarios should be familiar. You need to be familiar with those attack scenarios. You cannot be surprised with the process itself. Yes, you can be surprised with a vulnerability on a specific environment, on a specific technology. That's something that can and will happen, most probably. However, if you don't understand how that can be then leveraged in your organization and used against the business objectives and as part of the ecosystem, then you don't have the visibility and you don't have the context that you should have as the defender for your organization. So if you take those three items and you integrate those into the process of getting the visibility and later into the decision-making process, then you are in a much better situation, first, to prioritize the risk, and second, to react accordingly. And we'll show you how we are doing that in a second as one example. So what I'm going to show you here is a process on how we are taking a scientific approach from the visibility phase of getting access to what assets we manage, what are the threat scenarios or vulnerabilities that we were able to identify in our organization, how those are connected together, and how we can take all of this information and actually formalize not only a mitigation plan from this specific process, but the most effective or cost-efficient mitigation planning, even optimal for your organization. Let's talk about it. So first of all, let me explain what we see here. On the left side of the screen, what you see, those are the potential threat sources for the organization. A basic question that you need to ask yourself as part of a process that is called a threat model, right? You need to ask yourself two questions. Who are your threat sources? I mean, who is actually threatening your organization, right? And second, what are the business critical assets? We don't need to speak about the technical language here. On the business side, what are the most important things? Whether it's operational continuity, financial fraud, safety, sensitive data, privacy, reputational damage, you list all of those items, and then you know what you want to protect. Then if you can even prioritize those, that will be even better in order to do that. So when you take these two, let's say, pillars of threat sources and business critical assets, you're able to create a model that then will be fulfilled with the attack routes that will take you from the left side to the right side. So when we start an engagement with a customer, right, we will take all of those potential threat sources and we'll start our offensive activities to really try and emphasize what can be done from each and every one of those. And as you can see, once we found the vulnerability, we will try to see what can be done from this vulnerability exploitation and how we can take it to the next level, as Matt mentioned at the beginning, right? So we drop the Cobalt Strike, then we look for a way to get to the domain controller, and then from the domain controller, we look for a way to move laterally to other servers and then to encrypt those servers. For example, something that will harm the availability of the servers or downtime or operational continuity, as you can see here, right? So that's something that we can map, and based on this mapping, we are able to understand the full context of the attack. That's the first step to understand. So a list of vulnerabilities, it's a totally different approach than a connected list of those, how those vulnerabilities are connected together, and how those take you from the left side of the threat sources to the right side of the business critical assets. I mean, just translating the view from the list to this kind of view will take you a very long way and will give you the context, the initial technical and business context that you need in order to fulfill the things that we mentioned in the previous slide. Then we take it now to a more scientific approach, taking it from the visibility phase to the mitigation phase, which from my point of view, this translation process is in a lot of organizations very, let's say, insufficient, because in most cases, you will get your report from either a red teaming company or any kind of scanner that you have or any internal kind of activity that you are doing for auditing or for a penetration testing in your organization. But then the translation to the actual mitigation plan, in most cases, as I mentioned before, will be, okay, let's fix the critical item first, then the high level items, and if we have more budget, more appetite to fix and so on, we'll go with the medium level and low level. But here we are actually recommending a totally different approach. Let's anticipate those roadblockers, critical path items for the offensive part, for the attacker, and let's try to disconnect those items, right? So instead of thinking in a passive reactive way, we are trying to think in a proactive prescriptive way to take a process of identifying the critical path, as Matt mentioned before. If we know that they are going to go through the domain controller, let's protect this specific point, or at least put the relevant detection capabilities there to be able to identify that and react accordingly. So that's the concept of what we've presented. Now, taking it to the next level, we've added several capabilities that can be actually done at some level, let's say in every organization. So the second thing that we've added is the quantification or the likelihood quantification for exploitation. To explain that for a second, per vulnerability, which is, let's say, is an easier analysis, we are trying to evaluate the resources, the capabilities, and the investment level required by the attacker to first identify the vulnerability and second to exploit it. Now, we have developed a very sophisticated algorithm that has sampling-based concept and machine learning concept and so on, but I'm saying that even a basic algorithm here, even a basic sampling based on several parameters will be more than sufficient to start your effort. So just to give you an example, let's talk about a specific vulnerability. Is this vulnerability exposed to the interface or to the location that you are at? That means that you are able to identify that. That's number one question. Second, does exploitation require user interaction? Second thing that you can ask yourself. Then, do you have an exploit available? Third question that you can ask yourself. And those kind of questions, when you combine them together by a very basic matrix or matrix that you can, or criteria that you can create, you're able to get to a very similar approach of, assigning values, even if it's a value of a scale of 1 to 5, right? It gives you the same capability then to be able to quantify the risk over an attack route, a complete attack route, by just multiplying those values, and then prioritize the attack routes based on what is more commonly or commonly expected, or what is going to happen, let's say, in a predictive kind of measure for your organization based on your analysis of your weaknesses in the organization. Once you have this state of mind, once you have this understanding, you're really able to take the entire process and start, put actual science into it. And, everything that you do around quantification and prioritization will be based on pure numbers. So no guesstimations. You don't need to work with your, let's say, stomach. You feel that this one is more important than this one and so on. Here you have pure mathematics, pure numbers, and you can just follow the process in a very, let's say, structured way. So I'll take you to the next slide just to understand that. Once we've calculated all of the attack routes, we'll start with the most probable attack route. Right? We'll ask ourselves, let's assume that an attacker is going to attack us, and assume that the attacker is going to choose the most, let's say, the easiest route in, and that's a very fair assumption. We can talk about that if you want, but an attacker, as I said before, offensive group, this is really a business like any other business. They will invest minimum in order to get maximum by definition. Sometimes they have some kind of surprise, like a zero-day vulnerability or something similar. That's great, but that will be one link in this specific chain that I'm showing you now. And what we are trying to evaluate here is the entire attack route. Okay? Once we've identified that, we are able to go to multiple algorithms that are out there today, but one of them is, for example, Ford-Fulkerson algorithm that we use and we utilize ourselves. It takes into consideration the max flow min cut theorem. Again, I'm taking you back to algorithms course in the university long time ago. There we learned something very basic. If you have 2 points in a graph and you want to disconnect it in the optimal way, that means maximal risk reduction and minimal cost, you will evaluate all the potential, let's say, disconnecting points in this specific subgraph, and based on that, you'll choose the optimal solution. Again, this is an algorithm that sounds very sophisticated, but it's really straightforward. For example, in this case, we'll analyze each and every one of the attack of these specific links in the chain of attack. And then we know that in this case, this is a very simple route, without circles and without double edges. So it's very simple here. Every edge that you'll cut will actually disconnect this specific attack route. So here it's very simple. Let's go with the cheapest one, right? And we'll be able to disconnect this specific attack route. And this way we know that we will put an obstacle for the attacker in this specific attack route, because we will disconnect an attack route from happening, and then we'll go to the next one, right? So in this case, the optimal way to do that is, for example, in this case, to fix the configuration problem in a file upload, the vulnerability that was exposed to the internet, and then we will calculate the next item and start the process again. In this case, you see, for example, this is a very common attack route from a compromised employee, starting very similar to what Matt just mentioned before. You start with a PC, then you go to a lateral movement, in this case based on password reuse. Then you'll get to a domain. You can see administration credentials. Here you can see the Exchange server that will be the next one to be attacked. And then you get both operational continuity problem, sensitive data exposure, reputational damage, and of course, in some cases, it can lead, depending on the organization, to safety kind of issues. But at this point, again, if we are disconnecting this password reuse problem, and as Matt mentioned before smartly, right? If you don't have an attack surface, if you're going to do ransomware attack on one server, then it's not a ransomware attack. It's limited scope. Again, can be severe. I don't take it, for granted. That's something very important to take into consideration. However, the scope is very limited. It's a totally different magnitude of an attack, right? And that's the process. That's how we work, and we actually disconnect the entire graph one by one by just following this process. So just to make it clear, again, the process started with just taking the list of vulnerabilities and actually organizing them in a form of graph that is, the vulnerabilities are connected to each other in order to form a concept of attack routes. Before that, we started with a threat model, identifying the potential threat sources, and the business critical assets. Again, an essential phase. If you want to protect your organization, you have to know what you're trying to protect and who you're trying to protect against. Once we've done that and we've connected those items, then you are able to create a simple method for evaluation of those specific likelihoods for exploitation. Again, if someone needs help with that, I'm more than happy to take it offline and to help you with something that is basic. Again, we've took it to a different level of calculation today, something that is very accurate, machine learning based and so on. However, as I said before, even a simple program, a simple capability will take you to really a different level of understanding of your context and your visibility in your organization. In the end
Reuven,
of the process,
I'm sorry, my apologies. No, keep going, keep going.
no, just a last sentence. In the end of the process, you get a situation that all of those specific vulnerabilities that you've identified will be prioritized based on the process that I mentioned before. Let's identify 2 points in the graph that will be the most relevant as next attack route. We'll find a way to disconnect those. This will be priority 1, and we continue with an iterative process until we actually cover all the vulnerabilities that were identified in a specific order. And in this process, you also get something that we call the critical to block group. And that's a subset of the vulnerabilities that once you mitigate, you will create a fully disconnected graph from the left side to the right side. That means no known route from the left side to the right side, and that's something that we call the critical to block, which we also usually call it like the minimal risk that you have to mitigate.
Oh, I like that. I like the way that you classified that. So there's so much awesome takeaway in this graph right here. I want to spend a little bit of time with our attendees looking at this too. So Reuven, first off, thanks for walking us through that. I absolutely love how you I'm not gonna lie, how you brought me back to math class and reminded me about finding the shortest distance between 2 points, but then also saying from a defense perspective, what's also the cheapest or most effective way to go about this. And I think that's a great concept for our defenders out there to jump and seize on. Is look at how they've brought this kind of these various paths together. And from a critical attack path perspective, this is what we mean when we say visibility. When we say visibility is key, we say visibility is necessary. We say you can't defend what you can't see, and so on and so forth. Folks, this is exactly what we're talking about in this case right here. And I want to insert maybe a little bit of a different approach, not different from Reuven, different from what you may be thinking. When a lot of folks think visibility, and I gave you the simple question in the beginning, which was how many Windows systems do you have? When a lot of people think visibility, they think number of assets in my environment. And that's it. That's as far as they go with visibility. But visibility in your environment is so much more. Remember, when I went back and I showed you those commands from that adversary in that ransomware attack that's in that DEFA report, folks, at no point in time was there a single command that ran that said count number of systems in the environment and that kind of stuff. Instead, when an attacker builds visibility of your environment, they're doing exactly what Reuven just walked you through. They are looking for paths of least resistance. They are looking for the easiest way to get from point A to point B. They're looking for the most efficient way from point A to point B. And of course, I'm looking at the threat sources to the left-hand side here. My example only focuses on that top source, that internet attacker, the one who's coming and accessing the environment remotely. Folks, Reuven went and took us to the next level. He introduced 3 other different threat sources that visibility is, I would say, even more important for, because the adversary in this case already has the one key element that the internet attacker does not have, and that is some form of trust. An on-site attacker is on-site. Physically, they may be next to something. That compromised employee has trust. They are supposed to be there, right? One of the easiest things, Reuven, that we say about detecting an attacker is look for what doesn't belong. And the employee belongs there. And then the supply chain entry vector, I'm going to call it an entry vector, threat source entry vector. I hope these are synonymous for everyone. But when it comes to the supply chain things, let's just look at the past. Well, it's almost been the past year now. But if we think back to December of last year, We had the massive SolarWinds incident. We're not going to go through that one in detail. I just want to remind everyone, we've had some pretty significant incidents, from SolarWinds to Kaseya to other things that took place. We've had some pretty significant supply chain attacks. And once again, this is a trusted entity that has access into the environment. So as Reuven really laid out for us in a great manner, when it comes to visibility, we're not just talking number of assets. We're not just talking, how many of this versus how many of that. We're talking about that overview of what it would take to move through your environment from step A to step B. And Reuven, I gotta say, I love the graph that you have here, because it's not just like system to system. It almost feels like it's almost like operation to operation, if you will. Yeah, so there we go, exactly. Let's go forward one more. Yeah, perfect. So for example, hopping network access to public website to restricted internet interface right there. I love how that's not like a system necessarily, right? That is a measure. That is a control that should be in place. And that's what we mean when we say visibility in depth. And I love the statistical mathematical approach that you guys take towards it. And thanks for walking us through that. But this, oh, perfect. I was going to ask you to go to this slide. This right here, everyone, this is the slide that helps you make decisions. This is the understanding of that attack route that helps you make decisions, because again, think back to my vulnerability story, right? What does this vulnerability do? What protocol does it go after, and how does it work? Blah, 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 blah. Okay, I'm fine. See you later. Go to bed, right? I equate this to some folks. It's almost like, if someone came at you and said, hey, someone's going around, they're trying to break into homes, and they're doing so using a wooden hammer, let's just say, right? You're like, well, I have an anti-wooden door, so I'm good to go, no problem. Very basic example, but apply that to, apply that to a security context. And if someone says, hey, they're going after internet-facing SMB, okay, I don't have any, no problem, we're good to go. But what if we did? Well, what's the chances that something takes place? And you all know, those of you, especially those stakeholders signing checks and everything, you know more than I do. Reuven, how often do you get asked, what is the risk of something? What's the risk that this is going to happen? And that's what businesses really assess. And I love that it's right here in front of us. These statistical percentages, the likelihood of something happening, where can we prioritize our defense operations? Where can we prioritize defense spend? I love the way this comes together, and I'm a huge proponent of visibility, so I love the way you're representing it here as well.
And Matt, if you correlate it also to, if you also know to quantify, for example, what will be the cost in case of this business critical asset like being compromised, then not only that you have the likelihood, you also have the impact, and then you can actually come to your board of directors and say, hey, you know what, guys, here we have 20 million of a risk. In order to mitigate it, I need 200K. Now make a decision.
Yeah.
You can make a decision. Of course, someone can say yes, someone can say no, but at least it's visible and you can make decisions based on numbers. And I think that, when you have likelihood and you have the potential impact, which, that's something that we've created a lot of capabilities in order to be able to calculate that as well based on, historical data breach or data on cost of breach. But again, every organization can quantify in the end what will be the cost for operational continuity, what will be the cost for sensitive data loss and privacy loss and reputational loss and so on and so forth, at least in ballpark numbers. Again, that will be a very practical tool in your presentation to your higher management in your organization. Keep that in mind. It's a very powerful tool.
So Reuven, what you're telling me is I can go to a meeting and ask for a specific amount of money to defend against a specific amount of risk, as opposed to saying I need budget, but I can't tell you why.
Exactly. which is the problem of cybersecurity. It's always considered to be a cost center rather than a business enabler. And I think that that's the wrong way to look at it. And when you quantify differently and you understand, at management, you understand the risk and you understand also the potential that you can get from the cybersecurity add-ons that you add to your organization, then it's a totally different discussion.
Agreed, 100%. And I love the way I love the way that came together. So Reuven, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think we are at the last slide, or I know we went back a little bit, but I think we're kind of at the last slide. So we might have some time to move towards, oh, never mind. I'm sorry. We do have more. Thank you so much. I was like, I think there's one more in here.
I mean, we can go through it. I mean, I already finalized that. I mean, we discussed that. We start with visibility, then risk visibility. That means the specific likelihood quantification, and in the end, you come up with a mitigation plan. Again, we can share the presentation as well, so that's not the point. I really want to see whether if we have any questions, of course, from the audience, that will be more than happy to answer those.
Certainly, certainly. Excellent. Okay, well, with that, Reuven, first off, thanks for letting me join you in this discussion. We're not leaving yet, obviously. I think we do have some questions lined up, but I just want to say thanks for letting me join you in that discussion, especially because we got a chance to focus on my favorite topic, which is always going to be visibility and how to use visibility effectively. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Carol. Carol, do we have any questions that we can hopefully tackle from our attendees? I think we've got a lot of interested attendees here. I hope we've got some questions lined up.
All right, yes, we do have some questions, so I'll jump in and get started. This one is for Reuven. It says, do you consider key business cycles and timelines, for example, key revenue generation periods, key financial reporting dates, key industry dates, key program increment planning periods, etc., as an organization business asset or liability or potential threat vector?
So let me start from the beginning. First, of course, we take it into consideration first in our cycles. That means that we don't interfere with anything that, for example, if you are in e-commerce and now it's the end of the year and we are before Christmas, we won't do anything that will slow down the business, right? That's something that, of course, very important. And I think in general, security has to be, like the team enabler and not something that, blocks you or slows down the business. That's number one concept. Now, from my point of view, we don't think that those are liabilities in the organization, but actually some kind of business important processes, maybe not assets, but processes that has to be maintained and protected by the same concept that we just mentioned before. So when you have a critical period, let's even take like an IPO, for example, right? And company is going to face an IPO. That's a critical point in the organizational lifetime, right? You want to make sure that IPO goes very smoothly. That means that you need to be prepared for that. You need to understand, again, which potential threat sources are going to threaten this specific process, and to take the relevant preventive and detective measures in order to be able to run a smooth operation there. So from my point of view, definitely something that you take into consideration when you consider the cybersecurity objectives for the organization. So it's not only to protect the system, protecting a process or protecting a specific revenue cycle or protecting a specific IPO or something similar. All of those items are highly important, and the prioritization process has to be dynamic. It's not that you set it one time at the beginning and then it stays there forever. You have to keep updating those business critical assets and also the potential adversaries or access points to your environment.
All right, thank you.
That answers the question.
All right, this next one asks, it says, for the slide calculating the likelihood, what do the percentages mean? Does a probability of 50% mean half attacks will get this far? We'll get this far.
I'm going back to that slide for you, Reuven.
Yeah, so just to explain that, the likelihood is actually per vulnerability. Those are independent events because then we want to really multiply those items, right, one by one. So practically speaking, that means let's take, for example, the first example that you see from this position going to the file upload vulnerability. 92% meaning that based on our measurement, the likelihood for this one to be identified and exploited, assuming you're already here, right? So first we don't calculate what is the likelihood to get to this point. This is a different vulnerability, okay? We are assuming that we are starting from this point. Now at this point, we are starting to calculate from this point what will be the likelihood of this item to really be identified and exploited. Of course, higher number, meaning easier to identify and exploit, lower number, meaning something that is harder to identify, requires multiple, let's say, techniques or capabilities or skills, and of course, a significant investment. So, usually something like 1 or 2% will be a nation-level capability, and everything that will be above 85% will be a viral attack, like NotPetya or things that Matt mentioned before, like with the WannaCry situation or with the Eternal Blue kind of capability. Maybe even to give you this example, when we started with Eternal Blue, when we heard about it for the first time, before an exploit was actually available, it was around 6% of a likelihood that this is something to happen. 3 weeks later, it was 96%. Right? When the exploit became available and we started to see that the exploit in CVSS 10 and everything, all SMB, like port 445, TCP that were exposed to the internet were immediately compromised by this specific part. So this is also a live measurement. Okay.
All right, thanks. This next one asks, should I model an attack route based on a particular threat actor?
Oh, I can start with that one, Carl. I think I was actually thinking about this, Reuven, as you were walking through this. I can understand anyone who's looking through this right here. This kind of feels like, this looks like you're looking at different attack techniques. It almost feels like, I'm hoping this question comes from this particular slide as well, because you might look at this as, well, based on all the threat actors out there, you know, there's a 71% chance of an auth bypass in the very beginning and things like that. Therefore, should I go after threat actors? And I kind of thought the same thing. I saw myself wanting to kind of align this with threat actors that I had seen or before. But actually, I ended up kind of stepping back. And Reuven, you just walked through kind of the statistical analysis that goes behind this, which is the likelihood of something happening. And you correct me if I'm wrong, this is independent of an actor, correct? This is likelihood based on, I'm going to say maybe public availability of something versus prevalence in the industry.
Not only, actually, we take into consideration.
I don't want the secret sauce, by the way.
No, I don't mind sharing. I mean, from my point of view, you know, we take threat actors into consideration on a continuous basis. Our approach is threat intelligence led. So when we see something new, for example, a new threat actor coming from Russia now is trying to attack SolarWinds, right? Because they have a vulnerability in Orion, because they managed to put a backdoor in the system. Now the likelihood for exploitation grows dramatically, but on average, right, it's not that every, let's say, attack source or every threat actor is able to exploit that until that becomes public. So the likelihood will be increased because there is an option to really exploit it, but it won't be 90% because it's only one adversary. So from our point of view, that's definitely something that we take into consideration. However, the independent parameters are also influencing you. That means access, exposure, available exploit, and so on, other things that we took into consideration. So analyzing a specific threat actor, that's something that can be done on a specific use cases. If you have, let's say, very accurate threat intelligence saying, hey, you know what, we know that this group is going to attack us, then yes, let's do the analysis for this specific group. And that's something that is easily done also in our platform because you can filter based on those capabilities, right? But generally speaking, that's something you need to be protected against everyone. And that's the problem of being a defender, right? You need to be prepared for everyone. So if you have, my take on that, if you have specific threat intel, or you know that your industry is under attack and so on and so forth, and you want to know how protected you are against a specific adversary, sure, let's go and do that for a specific adversary. Again, in our platform, it's easy. Click of a button. Just choose the threat actor and you're there. But if you want to do that even internally, you can just store the data. You know, in the end, you build this kind of graph based on data. And if you do the right data analysis, you are able to filter that also on your own. But from my point of view, the broader view is something that needs to lead you on a day-to-day basis. In specific situations, yes, a specific threat actor is important to analyze.
Agreed. And Reuven, I'm gonna actually take what you said, because I ended up where you're talking about. I ended up in the general sense, which is I'm looking at this graph right here, you know, and you talk about likelihood of auth bypass and stuff like that. You gave a great example, right? SolarWinds was one attacker, but it was one attacker at one stage. It was one attacker at one, maybe two links of the attack. But after that, it then became almost any attacker, right? Because
exactly the point. Exactly the point. Right? The access was very specific, special, 0-day, whatever you want to call it. But right after that, it's the same. And that's the point.
So if you told me, hey, we need to defend, and hopefully I'm still answering the attendee's question here, but if you told me, hey, we need to defend against an auth bypass, I would say, to me, the follow-up question would not be from who. It would be more of, well, that could be anyone, So yeah, let's definitely, stand up against that. But then also the nice thing about this here is if you approach it from, I think the approach that Reuven and folks are taking over at CYE, you get to that base level understanding that it's, one critical path or one part of the path can actually upset multiple types of threat actors. So rather than focusing on one, focus on the broader side, as Reuven's saying, and you'll actually find your impact is pretty exponential. It gets exponentially larger a lot quicker because, again, even that SolarWinds impact, right? It's a very, very narrow way in. Then they quickly funneled out to, oh, okay, it's persistence via services and scheduled tasks. Gotcha. All right, well, that's almost everyone out there. So it quickly funnels out, and I think that's a great way to kind of layer those two things on top. So I hope we got that question for that attendee, but that was a good question. Carol, I think are we almost out, Carol?
Yeah, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Matt and Reuven, for your great presentation, and to CYE for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.